In this lecture, we will look at Inca imperial strategies and compare them with those of the Aztec. Earlier, we looked at the emergence of state-level societies in the dry coastal deserts of western Peru, and now we'll look at an empire that emerged in the highland valleys and then extended its control down to the Pacific coast and even into the upper reaches of the Amazon basin. The Cusco Valley, the home of the Inca, the location of their capital city, Cusco, is at an elevation of greater than 11,000 feet. It is beyond the limits of corn agriculture, and there are limitations based upon this elevation, short growing seasons, and few crops that can be grown there. Potatoes, quinoa, a variety of goosefoot that was domesticated. Other crops like cotton, corn, chili peppers, sweet potatoes, peanuts had to be grown at lower elevations. While the highland valleys were not ideal for agriculture, they were ideal for raising herds of llama and alpaca for both meat and wool, but also to provide a source of transportation. So highland resources like potatoes and quinoa and dried meat and wool could be traded to coastal communities for the resources that they had that could not be produced in highland valleys. So like the Aztec, the expansion of the Inca was in order to gain access to resources that were not available in the local environment. Rather than trading for them and paying high costs, it was their strategy to incorporate these areas into their empire in order to gain control of these resources and control production. The Inca, however, were not the first empire to arise in the Andes. Earlier empires had risen and fallen. Many of the strategies of the Inca built upon strategies that were initiated in these earlier empires. South American cultural chronology is divided into a series of periods. The initial period, which we spoke about, is the emergence of state-level societies in coastal Peru from 3000 to 900 BC, and then a series of alternating horizons and intermediate periods, horizons being periods of widespread political and economic integration across ecological zones linking highland communities and coastal communities, while the intermediate periods were times of political and economic fragmentation. During the early horizon, a culture known as Chavin arose that was widespread across the Andes and integrated with coastal communities, but it was not an empire in the sense that the later Wari and Tiwanaku and Inca were. It seems to have largely been a religious system that integrated economic interaction between these communities rather than the exertion of political or military might from a central source. During the middle horizon, the Wari and Tiwanaku were contemporaries, Wari being more of a traditional militaristic empire centered upon a single capital that extracted resources from its periphery, although Tiwanaku seems to have been something different and more like Chavin, an economic system that was integrated by religious beliefs and values and a system of pilgrimage to a center. But little evidence of militarism or political violence. And in the late horizon, the Inca Empire arose, emerging out of a contentious political environment of city-states dominating individual mountain valleys and competing against each other. And the Inca came to consolidate power, conquering and subjugating their neighbors and integrating them into an ever-expanding empire that eventually extended from the Pacific coast into the Andes and even into the upper headwaters of the Amazon. Like the later Inca, the Middle Horizon empires of the Wari and Tiwanaku were also centered in highland valleys. The Tiwanaku in the Lake Titicaca Basin, along the boundary between modern Peru and Bolivia, and the Wari in the Ayacucho Valley in south-central Peru, northwest of the location of the Cusco Valley where the Inca later arise. Both of these empires invested in intensive agricultural production, investing in infrastructure in order to support and expand agricultural production. The Wari grew corn and tubers and used terraces in order to expand the amount of agricultural land that was available in the steep valleys in most of their domain, whereas Tiwanaku used raised beds in the seasonally flooded Titicaca Basin in order to increase production of tubers and quinoa. But the highland valleys in which they were located, both above 10,000 feet, required them to expand and either conquer or engage in trade with neighboring areas in order to gain access to low elevation crops. In some cases, they established colonies, moving highland populations into lowland valleys, taking areas under their control and placing them under agricultural production. While our knowledge of these two earlier empires is expanding, it is still limited compared to what we know about the later Inca. In fact, until the late 1940s, these two cultures were not distinguished. They share a lot of characteristics, particularly iconography and certain deities, that we will look at later because the Inca also used these deities. And these deities had originated in the early horizon, centered at Chavin de Huantar in north-central Peru. Archaeological research on the Wari was limited in the 1970s until just recently because the Ayachucho Valley was also the center of the Shining Path guerrilla movement. It was difficult for archaeologists to work in an active war zone. Another faculty member here at Mesa Community College, Dr. Kirk Costian, works in this region, working specifically in the frontier zone between these two empires. They were contemporaries, they had a common boundary, but they do not seem to have competed against each other militarily. And Dr. Costian works in a research project in a lowland coastal valley where these two empires each established agricultural colonies. His research and the research of his colleagues that also work at ASU are interested in understanding the interaction between these two different empires along their frontier. Both of these empires were declining during the AD 900s, and both had collapsed by AD 1000, and it seems to have been related to a long-term period of climate change, of increasing aridity during that century. These droughts would have led to declining agricultural production, limited the ability of the state to effectively administer distant areas and extract resources from them, limit their ability to finance the activities of the state, leading to the loss of control first of peripheral areas and then loss of control even in the central parts of their domain. The Middle Horizon was followed by the Late Intermediate period when there was increasing political and economic fragmentation as each valley came to be controlled by a different city-state, and these city-states competed against each other, but none were able to rise to dominance. At the end of the Late Intermediate period, the city-state of Cuzco began to expand during the reign of Pachacuti, beginning in AD 1438. Inca, often spelled with a K, means ruler in Quechua. You will note that when I refer to the Inca Empire, I spell it I-N-C-A, and that is often used to distinguish between the political system that archaeologists and historians recognize and the term that was used to refer to the ruler of this political and economic system, Inca. Pachacuti, the first Inca, his name translates as he who remakes the world, and he did remake the world that he lived in, conquering and integrating wide areas under his domain, and he was succeeded by his offspring and his descendants in continuing to expand this domain. Under his successors, the Inca Empire came to incorporate all of the former territories of the Wari and Tiwanaku and more, extending further south down into Chile and northwestern Argentina, and further north up into Ecuador and the far southwestern tip of Colombia. From their initial consolidation and beginnings of expansion until they were conquered by the Spanish, the Inca and the Aztec were roughly the same length of time, 92 years for the Aztec Empire and 95 years for the Inca Empire. However, the Inca Empire was nearly 9 times larger than the Aztec Empire. In comparison to a European empire, Rome, it was 2.5 million square miles, incorporating much of the Mediterranean basin, Western Europe, and the Middle East. However, Rome was 500 years of continuous expansion, incorporating further out, extending their boundaries and frontiers further. And imagine, if the Spanish had not arrived, would the Aztec and the Inca perhaps have come to contact each other, come to have a boundary between each other? Something maybe you could write a historical novel about. But what factors allowed the Inca Empire to expand to such size, much greater in size than the contemporary Aztec Empire? The Inca Empire was divided into 4 provinces, and where these provinces came together was centered on the Valley of Cusco, the capital city. Each province was subdivided into additional administrative units in a nested hierarchy that was overseen by a provincial governor who reported directly to the Inca, and in most cases was a relative of his. These administrative units were nested in multiples of 10, going down to the smallest unit, the Huaranca, of 1,000 taxpayers. A key factor to the ability of the Inca to expand their domain and maintain control over this vast domain was their investment in infrastructure, particularly their investment in a road system. Now, this expanded upon an older Wari network of roads within central Peru, and some of the roads that connected the central Andes and the Pacific coast may have first been built during the early horizon, but the Inca system vastly expanded upon these earlier road networks and included an estimated 40,000 kilometers or 25,000 miles of road. There were 2 primary north-south routes, one along the coast, one through the highlands, and various connecting routes between the coast and the highlands. These roads could be up to 10 meters wide, were often paved with stone, and had associated ramps, stairs, bridges, and retaining walls to allow them to traverse difficult and steep terrain. Along the roads were tampu, specialized rest and supply stops for state officials that were located every 1 day's travel, where they could stop and be resupplied with food, sleep for the night, and be provided with other resources they might need to conduct state business. Runners were also used to quickly move information, allowing the conditions in different provinces and in distant areas to be monitored and controlled from the capital at Cusco. We will look at 2 specific Inca sites, Cusco, the capital, and Huanuco-Pampa, a provincial administrative center in the north. Both are shown on this map with red stars. This is an Inca road between Cusco and Machu Picchu that is still in use. If you travel to Cusco and walk to Machu Picchu, you would follow this road. And there are many roads that are of Inca era that are still in use in many parts of rural South America. As the Inca conquered and subordinated different city-states and neighboring valleys, they revived many of the political and economic strategies of the earlier Wari Empire, including state involvement in the construction and management of agricultural terraces, such as this one that we see here, Patayacta. The state directly invested in improving agricultural infrastructure with terracing and irrigation in order to increase productivity that would provide a greater share of resources for the state to use to finance its activities, to finance the lifestyles of the elite, to finance their military, and to finance additional construction projects in order to increase agricultural production even more in many cases. Other construction projects included building and maintaining the road network and the associated tampu. The road network improved the flow of people, goods, and information, allowed for increased administrative efficiency, but perhaps most importantly, for control, allowed the ability to mobilize military power more effectively, allowed them to prevent internal dissent and expand external control. The mobility of Aztec armies were limited by the lack of investment in infrastructure of roadways. They did not have a managed and maintained system of roads. In fact, much of the Aztec region was impassable during the rainy season, limiting large campaigns where you had to move many men and the resources to support them to the dry season. And the limitations to effectively exert their power at will allowed a greater opportunity for those groups on the fringes of the empire to resist, or perhaps those that had been subordinated to throw off the yoke of subordination. While the Aztecs sometimes moved colonists from the basin of Mexico into conquered areas, the Inca did this on large scales. It was called Mitmac. It was a system of colonization where populations would be moved under state direction from one part of the empire to the other. In some cases, it was used to break up conquered groups in order to prevent or limit their ability to resist. At other times, it was used to maximize the economic exploitation of certain productive capabilities, providing low elevation crops for the state, especially corn for chicha, via terracing and irrigation, or to expand wool production for textiles in highland valleys. There was a highly organized system of taxation that was directed centrally by the state and extended all the way down to individual households, as opposed to sort of a pyramid scheme that is seen in many more feudal societies where different levels of nobles are required to extract tribute that they pay on behalf of their subjects to their overlord. In the Inca case, it was highly directed from the central authorities down through their representatives down to individual households, and it obligated not just resources that had to be produced, agricultural products or craft goods that would be produced and contributed to the state's coffers, but also obligated community labor for state construction projects, and obligated men to be ready for conscription into the military in times of need to supplement the full-time professional military class for large campaigns. The vast amount of resources that were collected through the META system required supporting systems of storage and accounting. And throughout the empire, there were koika, imperial warehouses that were used to store goods that would be used to finance state operations. The resources would be collected in and then redistributed around these koika, sent to where they were believed to be needed or where they could be staged for later use. There was a system of record-keeping called kipu, where sets of knotted cords were used to record numeric information about taxes, contents of koika, census data for certain taxable areas. Another strategy that the Inca used was co-opting local religious traditions into the state system of religion in order to direct the ritual activities of conquered people towards state-sanctioned goals. The primary god of the Inca, Viracocha, was the ancient staff god that had originated in the early horizon and was central to the religions of the earlier Wari and Tiwanaku. In the Inca pantheon, he was the creator of the sun and moon and stars, and the creator of all people. The Inca exerted control over the ancestral mummies of conquered people in order to assure their loyalty. We'll see how in the Andes, natural mummification of bodies led to interaction with the dead long-term and veneration of the mummies of distinguished individuals even after their death. Like the earlier Wari, the Inca also incorporated the ancient coastal pilgrimage and oracle site of Pachacamac into the imperial religion, allowing the oracle and the priests that supported this ancient temple to maintain their presence, but also building Inca facilities in order to associate this ancient power with the imperial religion. They also created new religious traditions that bound local elites to the expanding empire through a process known as capacocha, where local elites who were being incorporated into the empire would voluntarily sacrifice one of their children, who would then be deified and incorporated into the imperial religion. Some capacocha sacrifices that have been excavated archaeologically are on the very tops of mountains at elevations above 18 to 20,000 feet, and the newly deified sacrifices would be associated with these landforms that look down over the valleys where they had been born and where their parents and their relatives continue to reside. The staff god, who was the prototype for the Inca god Viracocha, is this ancient symbol of power and authority that originated in the early horizon at Chavin and was central to the religions of both Tiwanaku and the Wari. In the Chavin example, he seems to be holding staffs, which are actually San Pedro cactus, a hallucinogenic plant that grows high in the Andes. But by the time of the Tiwanaku and the Wari, the staffs on either side have been transformed into an atlatl held in the right hand and personifying a jaguar and a condor, and a dart or spear held in the left hand and personifying a combined anaconda and puma. Radiating out from his head are rays of the sun, many of which have the heads of pumas or jaguars. Note also on the faces of the Tiwanaku and Wari examples, below the eyes what appear to be tears, and the Inca called him the crying god, and it is because he wept after he created humans and intended them to live peaceably, yet they fought amongst each other. Andean mortuary ritual often involved prolonged interaction with the dead. The high elevations, the dry environments led to naturally mummified remains, which would be visited, venerated, interacted with, drunk with, and sometimes even brought out to ritual events. The mummies of past Inca were still believed to rule after their death, and would travel around their domain and be consulted by the living Inca. The control of conquered people's ritual and access to their ancestors could be used in order to focus ritual activities on state-sanctioned goals, and it could be used as a means of social control, with the threat of cutting off access to or even destroying mummies. This drawing shows the mummy of a past Inca being carried on a tour through his domain. This drawing comes from a letter that was illustrated by an individual known as Waman Poma. He was a member of the Inca nobility who lived immediately after the Spanish conquest, and wrote this booklet explaining Inca history, social customs, the organization of the empire, and as a letter to King Charles of Spain in order to explain the nature of Inca society and also to complain about the abuses of his imperial officers after the conquest. We'll see some other images from Waman Poma's book. Tombs that were easily accessible, allowing access to the mummified remains held within them, allowed people to interact with the dead on a regular basis. Here we see a mortuary rite where a deceased individual is being brought to the tomb to join with their forebearers in the family tomb. And on the left, we see a ritual activity of drinking with the dead, where a paired set of cups was used. One is being drunk by the living and one is being poured out as libations for the deceased within the tomb. These paired cups, or carrows, were also used in rites between individuals, often between the Inca and his subordinate nobles, or these lower-level nobles and those beneath them, in drinking rituals in order to seal the relationship between the patron and their client. And they would drink a corn beer. Corn beer was important for ritual activities and for public ceremonies. Huánuco Pampa was a provincial administrative center and capital of the northern province of Chinchonsuyu. It was established in 1475 in an area that had little previous settlement, and this was an area that was agriculturally marginal at an elevation of 12,500 feet. As you look at this overview of the site, you may see some small mounds in the center, and perhaps a series of walls that surround it. This area was ideal for raising llamas. These grasslands in the valleys and on the hill slopes allowed for the raising of herds of llamas and alpacas for meat and for wool. Huánuco Pampa was along the main road that connected Cuzco to the northern Ecuadorian territories. It was at a halfway point between Cuzco and these northern territories, and Ecuador had always been very resistant to Inca rule. The capital city of Quito, the capital of modern Ecuador, the valley that it is within, is surrounded by ancient Inca forts, as they had to fortify the administrative center that they established against the resistant locals. So they often had to send armies up this road into Ecuador to stamp out whatever recent uprising was boiling. The site has abundant coica, the warehouses, which in this map you can see at the lower left. A series of terraces were built on the slopes of the city, foundations for these warehouses. There are all sorts of imperial facilities also present in the city. A square with an ushnu, a platform in the center, that we'll see in a moment. There was a compound for the Inca to live in when he was traveling through his domain, inspecting and assuring the loyalty of his subjects. Attached to the Inca's compound, which is on the right side of the plaza in the center of the community, was a large hall for feasts that were held when the Inca would be present. On the north side of the plaza, there are two areas that are marked as the cloth manufacturer or women's residences. And within these sort of factories, women who were specially recruited from various communities wove fine textiles to be used by the state, used as rewards for loyalty, used to present uniforms to various imperial officers, not just in the military, but certain bureaucrats had distinctive costume that they wore and could be identified by the textiles that they wore. And to the north of this women's residence is an area referred to as men's residences, which is actually a barracks area for the permanent military class. Akiwasis are these state-sponsored textile mills, where akikoyas, chosen women who wove for the sun, women who were specially recruited because of their skills, produced textiles for the state to award to elites, allies, soldiers, and others. In the center of the plaza was a stone-faced earthen platform 3.5 meters high called an ushnu. It would support the throne of the Inca, or in some cases, the mummies of the past Inca during ceremonies, and it would be the point from which corn beer, chicha, would be distributed to the gathered masses, that the living and deceased Inca, in some cases, were demonstrating their generosity to their loyal subjects by feasting them and providing them with corn beer. In this overview of the site, you can see the ushnu rising above the central plaza, and you can also see the terraces on the hill slopes beyond that provided the foundations for the extensive warehouses, or coica, that were used to store resources, food for the 15,000 people who lived here, who lived above the limits of agriculture, and also resources that were stockpiled in order to supply armies that might be headed towards Ecuador in order to stamp out whatever recent uprising had started. These Koika complexes were strategically located throughout the empire and provided a node where locally produced goods would be collected as tributary taxes, and then they would be redistributed to other Koika depending upon the resources and where they were seen to be needed. Imported goods from other environmental zones could be stored in Koika. So at Huánuco Pampa, where they are above the limits of corn agriculture and above the limits of most agriculture, food resources would be imported and stored in these Koika and distributed among the community. And there would also be supplies that would be needed during military campaigns, so armies didn't have to carry these resources with them. They were strategically staged near the frontier zone for them to pick up en route to battle. So these Koika supported both administrative needs, management, and distribution and redistribution of tax proceeds. They also supported military needs, providing the needed supplies for military operations in order to maintain and expand Inca control. Now, the contents were recorded on these knotted sets of strings known as quipu, and in this image from Huánuco's book, we see the Inca, who bears a special staff and has a special crown or headdress and large ear spools. He is visiting with one of his imperial administrators, the manager of one of these Koika complexes, who is presenting to him a quipu that has a record of the contents and explaining to him what resources are stored and what is available. These Koika were well built in order to store and preserve these resources, and they were strategically located throughout the empire in order to provide resources as needed, both within the local community, allowing for redistribution of goods across different environmental zones, and providing for military armies that were on the march. The Inca did not develop a system of writing like we saw in Mesoamerica. Rather, they had this system of record-keeping. The quipu were strings of knotted cords suspended from a primary cord were used to encode information. And this information seems to have been primarily numeric data, counts. They were the accounting ledgers of Koika contents. They were tax rolls and collection records. And they were used to contain census data. Here is one of these quipu, a large and complex one. You have one primary cord, and in this case, hundreds of pendant cords coming down with knots on them, encoding different levels of information. You had a reading from Wired magazine that described an ongoing research project where archaeologists from Harvard University are cooperating with computer scientists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in order to try to decode and understand the nature of the information that is on these. And they have created computerized databases of the patterns of knots on all of the surviving quipu, and using that to try to look for repeated patterns. And there are ones where it seems like certain large quipu consolidate information that was also present in other smaller quipu, sort of consolidation of records at a larger scale, from single valleys to larger provinces to the entire empire. Other insights into quipu use have been provided by the recent discovery that there are some Aymara communities in isolated parts of Bolivia that still use some types of quipu in order to record information. So in the coming years, it is likely that a better understanding of quipu are going to be developed because of the application of new technologies, but also by consulting with the descendant populations of these ancient empires, much as our understanding of the Maya script was furthered by interacting with Mayan speakers and using their language and the patterns in their language to understand the writing. Quipus consist of a primary cord and dependent cords that are suspended from this primary cord. The pendant cords are often in groups and separated from each other, and there are a series of knots along these pendant cords. Subsidiaries refer to other strings that are tied onto the pendant cord that may also have additional knots on them. There are several different ways of recording different levels of information onto quipus. It has been known since 1923 how numbers were recorded, that there were different levels of numbers from the tens and then to the hundreds and then to the thousands up to the 10,000. So you combine sets of numbers within these different zones together to create larger numerals. There are also different ways of tying knots that could represent different levels of information. But there are other ways that also could record binary information, one or the other. How is the attachment of the pendant cord to the primary cord done? Which direction does it wrap over? To the left or to the right? Same thing with the direction that knots are tied, or the twist of the fibers that are put together, twisted together into the cordage, or certain colors that could be used, different colors and different color combinations. Now it might seem that binary information, one state or the other, has limitations on the types of information that can be recorded, but the computer that you are sitting in front of records all information in binary code, in ones and zeros. So lots of information, different levels of information can be indicated using simple binary codes. But is it writing? It's certainly a way of encoding information, but it doesn't allow the same levels of information to be recorded as is found in the writing systems of Mesoamerica, particularly the most complex and highly developed, the Maya-glyphic system of the Classic period, where they have the ability to encode verb tenses. They have the ability to choose between the ways certain words could be spelled using logographs or syllable signs, or even ways that the syllable signs were written and combined together that allowed sort of poetry to be used. The selections of how the word was spelled, what glyphs were used, indicated other levels of information that we perhaps still can't apprehend. But there is a lot of information that we still don't know about quipus, and it may be that there is some way of encoding higher levels of information that we don't currently understand. So what to remember? Building upon the accomplishments of earlier Andean cultures, the Inca created the largest indigenous empire in the Americas. They were contemporaries of the Aztec, although they never contacted one another as far as we know. The Inca were nearly 8 times larger. Both empires existed in the similar time frame, 92 years for the Aztec, 95 years for the Inca. But the Inca were 8 to 9 times larger in the territory that they controlled. And this greater extent and scale was maintained through the investment in certain infrastructure that allowed imperial control to be extended and maintained. The development of roads that allowed the movement of people, including military power, movement of resources, particularly moving resources between different environmental zones, and the movement of information, particularly allowing information to move quickly so conditions could be responded to, allowing imperial political and economic power to be maintained. These roads were accompanied by imperial warehouses where foods and military supplies could be strategically stockpiled. There was a highly organized system of taxation and labor obligations. Taxes could be paid with agricultural products and craft goods that were used to finance state operations, and labor was contributed to state projects like road construction or maintenance. Because of the high volume of information that needed to be stored and processed related to the system of taxation and the systems of warehousing resources. They had a system of record keeping, quipus, sets of knotted cords used to record tax information, census data, and the inventories of warehouses. The state also invested in expanding agricultural production through terracing and irrigation systems, because increasing agricultural production increased tax revenues, which you could then invest in more terraces and irrigation in order to increase agricultural production, to increase tax revenues. The Inca favored a very hands-on territorial imperial strategy rather than the more hands-off hegemonic strategy that the Aztec preferred. And while it did require a greater investment of resources to create and maintain power, it allowed a more stable system and allowed them to expand at a much greater rate and incorporate more territory than the contemporary Aztec.